Hello and welcome to another episode of the RevRx podcast. My name is Chad Potts and I'm your host. One of the things you may have noticed about life is that life is constantly changing. Well, our guest today, Christine Davies, helps people navigate these seasons of change, particularly seasons of loss and grieving, in her role as chaplain, minister, and spiritual director. You're going to love our conversation today as we do talk about grief and loss and how normal that is in several different areas of our life, not just pertaining to death. We're going to talk about self-care. We're going to talk about creating boundaries to allow ourselves to thrive in the ways that we were created to. We're going to talk about rest and the importance that that plays in our lives as well. So stay tuned until the end. You're going to want to hear everything that Christine has to tell us. And I can't wait to introduce you to my friend, Christine Davies. Christine, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I look forward to our conversation together.
Sure. I always like to ask people, how did you get to where you are today? So, of course, you have a background in ministry and in chaplaincy and now with this spiritual coaching space. How did you get here? Tell us a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, I will try to truncate it for you, but I could go on.
Yeah.
So I think it really started, I grew up in the church. I grew up in the Presbyterian church. My family was active members and I really took to it.
Mm-hmm.
I think they were bewildered by how much I took to it, but loved going to youth group and being in the bell choir and all of that. And I was convinced of God's presence in my life from a really young age and convinced of a calling that God wanted me to help the most people possible. And I thought the way to do that was through medicine. It may have helped that my mother was a nurse and kind of pushed me, down that path.
Sure.
And it was actually through working as an EMT and being in the backs of ambulances with people, because I wasn't a very good driver, so I was always in the back. As we were transporting people to the hospital, I could do minimal repair. I could wrap their wounds. I could give them oxygen and provide safe transport. But so much of what they were needing in those moments was someone to hold their hand, to be with them when they were in pain, to bear witness to their suffering. They were asking these questions of why is this happening, and someone to listen.
Sure.
And so that's actually more aligned of what I do. And also didn't help that I was terrible at organic chemistry. So I switched my major to pre-theological studies when I was in college, and that didn't feel like work. It just felt like something I enjoyed doing so much. Then I did go to seminary, and when I was in seminary, I wasn't really sure what my ministry path was going to take, because I didn't think working in a church was for me, being up preaching every week. I like the intimate conversations that happen here around podcasts and around bedsides. And so I went to seminary, but I also at the same time was doing a dual degree program, getting my master's of social work.
Awesome.
And so when I was doing social work for a little while and working as a counselor, I missed the opportunity to really go deep with people about the spiritual questions.
Sure.
So that's what led me back into, I did an internship as a hospital chaplain and then run a spiritual care department in a hospital. I teach people how to sit with others at the bedside, how to address some of these spiritual concerns.
Yeah.
And then I also became a trained spiritual director, because in the hospital, we are with people at their most vulnerable moments of their lives.
Absolutely.
And we don't see the unfolding of the story.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas as a spiritual director, I work in a private practice individually with people and get to see them, once a month over the course of their lives and really get to see what God is doing. So it's all similar, just a couple of different veins.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love how well equipped you are to just really be able to step into people's lives, help them during some of those vulnerable moments, because, whenever we feel so out of control, and let's face it, a lot of those accidents where people are, riding in the back of an ambulance, that's one of those out of control moments. But it helps to have someone come in and just be able to be with us. It's that ministry of presence. And that's one of those things that I really picked up on from you, is that you really have a giftedness in that ministry of presence to be able to come alongside people in some of their hardest times and say, it's going to be okay. Your story is a really fascinating one because you have so many different experiences, but yet you pull all that together. So think about what you're doing now as spiritual director. People are coming to you, you're teaching them how to abide with the Lord, how to stay connected with the Lord. What are some of the most common obstacles that you see from people really understanding their purpose in life, or even if they do understand it, really living that out? What's holding people back?
Yeah, so the issues that I see that come up for people are usually around various things. Discernment is one.
Mm,
If people are struggling to make a choice
yeah,
or figure out what's next in their lives and they're not sure, they might feel stuck or feel like they have two paths and they're not sure how to navigate those.
hmm
If people are feeling distant from God,
hmm
and wanting to have a deeper relationship, and exploring the depths of their relationship. So sometimes what we work with is when people are feeling angry at God.
yeah,
And as I see that a lot in the hospital,
mm,
from, when people are experiencing crisis, that anger at God often comes up,
sure,
and then getting to journey with people who are experiencing that more long term. We also look a lot at people's grief and loss in their life, and the way that might challenge what it was that they had believed to be true about their own faith,
sure,
their own spirituality. Another common theme is untangling sometimes the faith of our childhood that might not fit us anymore,
oh yeah,
and trying to figure out, okay, what is consistent and what is authentic to us. And unfortunately having to reconcile with some toxicity or
hmm
some problematic either behaviors or elements that people have experienced in the church and through that religious trauma
yeah,
that can be there, and spiritual abuse, unfortunately, and the ways in which that impacts our whole lives, and specifically a spiritual life. And then if people are wanting to engage in spiritual practices but have no idea where to start, so a lot of the people I meet with are Christian, but I meet with other people from other faith traditions or no faith traditions. They say, I wasn't raised with anything. I'm trying to figure out,
yeah,
what
that's
is
cool.
it that I believe? What is it that I value? And I'm not sure.
hmm
So helping them really lean into that and explore it together.
And it's super helpful to have a guide when you're going through times like this. And I deal a lot with young adults. So that age group of like 18 to 30. And that's really the time when we're wrestling with our faith. Um, we've got the childhood faith that we grew up with, through our teen years. Oftentimes that's our parents' faith. And, we've been taught this is what you believe, this is what you should believe, this is what you should do, this is what you should look like. Um, but then there seems to be a crisis of identity during that time frame, because then we need to begin to be able to say, okay, well, what do I believe because I believe it, not what do I believe because it's what I've always been told. And so there becomes this deconstruction of sorts, that I see a good
Hmm.
bit that happens.
Absolutely. How do I make it my own
Yeah, yeah.
and not just that the faith of my parents?
Absolutely. And so that's a very real challenge. And that's a common time when that happens, but it happens all through our life. And it may happen gradually and it may happen all at one time. But one of the things I've discovered is that's important to work through. We can just kind of say, oh, well, brush it aside. But until we make our faith our own, it's not going to be as meaningful to us.
Mhm.
We're missing so much when we're just kind of going through the motions because that's what we were taught to do. And so
Mhm.
I love that you can be a guide to some of those people who are struggling with that. I think deconstruction is healthy as long as you have reconstruction on the other side. I think a
Mhm.
lot of the problem with that age group in particular is that we have this crisis of deconstruction, but then there is no reconstruction. And so we tear down our
Mm.
faith, but then we just kind of give it up and we
Mm.
say, well, that wasn't for me. So I'm going to try some other method, some other way of coping with life, of working my way through life, of, satisfying and fulfilling myself. And we're missing so much. So,
And I think normalizing it,
yeah,
like you just did,
yeah,
is so crucial, right? So that
sure.
people know this is a natural part of human development,
Mm-hmm.
of faith development, that there is going to be an evolution of your thoughts. And thank goodness, right? If we only ever stayed static,
Yeah.
where's the fun in that?
Right.
But I do think people worry if they have any doubts, or if
Yes.
they're questioning, or analyzing something from a new and different way,
Sure.
that means they no longer have faith, or that their
Mhm.
spiritual life is not what it should be, and then, like you said, leaving it all apart. I like to use the image of almost like a string that's all knotted up, right? And what we're doing is we pull it apart slowly, right? String by string. But we don't just throw the strings away and say, I'm not even looking at that.
Yeah.
But it
Yeah.
does take work and precision to kind of parse it all out and untangle it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to look different
Yeah.
when it's untangled. The
I love
color
that
might be the
illustration.
same, the consistency, but
And
the
I
way
think
in
that
which it lays it's and hopefully that'll be stronger and more authentic.
yeah, absolutely. It's okay to have questions.
Mhm.
It's okay to have doubts. You should have questions. And realizing that, hey, this is the best place to be able to express those doubts and those questions.
Mhm.
If you can't have doubts and questions at church, where can you have doubts and questions? And
Yes.
so having a spiritual guide like yourself to kind of come alongside and say, okay, well, here's, this is a normal thing. This is an expected thing, but then also be able to help make sense of some of that. Is invaluable. So I really appreciate the work you're doing there. A couple of other jumping off places in your story as well that you shared with us. There's this whole concept of grief and loss.
Mhm.
It's the universal human experience, right? We're going to face grief and loss. If it's just part of being human, and it will happen at some point. But there are a lot of fears, uncertainties around that, and you'd mentioned even anger a lot of times.
Definitely.
Can you kind of walk us through a little bit of what that looks like from your perspective to kind of deal with this grief and this loss, both from a personal perspective? So, if I've been given a terminal illness, okay, what are some common feelings that I'm dealing with? And then also, okay, I'm dealing with the loss of a loved one. I'm grieving a loved one. What are some of those thoughts that you help decipher, that you help people
Yeah.
work through?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think to start us off, the recognition that when we talk about grief and loss, oftentimes in society, we're associating that with death.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad that we're talking more about
Mhm.
dying now, because I think for a while we really got away from that. And I think there's power in that.
Very true.
But also, there are lots of losses
Mhm.
that have nothing to do with death.
Yeah.
And so when people can identify those in their lives, something like, you lose a job,
Mhm.
or you break up with, your boyfriend or girlfriend,
Mhm.
or you move away, or you lose something that is of value to you, even if it's material. All of those, they may not feel as traumatic as the death of someone that you love, but
Right.
they're all losses. And I've even listed them all out before. There's, so many that we can look at.
Sure.
And anytime there's a loss, something as simple as, I moved to a new house, even though this is a nice house and I like it better, it's different,
Yeah.
right? I don't have the same neighbors. I don't have the same commute. I don't have the same community. Anytime there is a loss, there's going to be grief. So even those positive losses are going to have some grief to it. And I think it's about acknowledging that. I was just talking to someone the other day who finished an Ironman, triathlon.
Mhm.
And they said afterwards they kind of felt weird and in a funk. And I said, oh, that's loss, right? It's
Yeah.
even though it's a positive thing, it's something that you were preparing for. And now the feelings that are coming up associated with that
Yeah.
are ones of a little bit of despair, or not feeling like having a purpose. And,
Yeah. It's over. So yeah.
yeah. So to me, that's wild and to think about. And, the fact that, change is constant.
Mhm.
And so loss is nothing but change. And
Mhm.
so if change is constant, then loss is constant and grief is constant. So we are
Sure.
all grieving something at any given time. So that's my kind of overview about grief.
I love that. That's super helpful because, and I asked the question in a, perhaps in a framework of death, but I've experienced that as well. And it can even be something as simple as, okay, I had this health issue come up. I'm now no longer able to do X, Y, Z. And so
Mm-hmm.
you begin to kind of grieve through that process of that's a
Absolutely.
loss. And so, yeah, there's so much that we can
Yeah.
unpack there. So, yeah, anyway, keep going. I
So
love that.
yeah, so I think the first step is naming that, right?
Okay.
And I'm a big proponent of like if we can name it, we can tame it. If we know what we're working with versus something that's kind of amorphous and we can't really pinpoint and we sometimes, turn inward and think it's something wrong with us or
Yeah.
so I think naming it is really the first step in it and then figuring out okay how do I work with this, how do I process this, what might be helpful for me, and looking at the feelings that are around it certainly. And then I do think reaching out to others for support around that, and that can take on so many various forms. And this is, where the anger at God can come in, right? Because
Yes.
it's based on what are our own theological beliefs that we were either raised with or that we've now, taken on as our own. And sometimes those are the things that well-meaning, I call them the well-meaning church people,
Right.
say to us
Uh-huh.
when we are suffering that take root and can do more damage. So I like to call them like the religious platitudes.
Yeah.
So I hear a lot of them in the hospital around death, but they can be around any loss.
Sure.
Things like, oh, God needed another angel. Well, if you tell me that and my loved one has just died, I'm going to think that God's a bit of a jerk, right? For
Yeah.
intervening in that way.
Yeah, right.
And so the danger comes, and especially for those of you, your listeners that are listening that are in ministry themselves, the danger comes when we put our own interpretation onto other people and their experience because that
Yes.
silences their own pain. That kind of tells them that, they have to be positive. They're not allowed to express anything else. It can, ascribe descriptions of God that you have, but isn't, for that particular person.
Yeah.
And it just kind of it moves them through their grief process. It expects them to be further along in the journey than where they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
So grief never leaves us. It's always with us, but we move with it and it changes us. So it's not about moving on. But sometimes when we're given messages like that, and there's others, like everything happens for a reason and, let go and let God, it really can impact the recipient on that. Now,
Absolutely.
these are beliefs that I might believe for myself, right? I might think, yeah, like looking as I shared with you, like my journey earlier, I'm like, oh yeah, it makes sense that I can now see God's hand in that.
Yeah.
But if someone had told me in the middle of like, oh, this is what's going on, that's their interpretation. So that's shortchanging my opportunity to make meaning. And when people are in crisis, they're not making meaning. Right. They are, they're surviving in that moment. And so that comes later. So I answered about 5 different things with that one question, but I think they're all interrelated.
Yeah, that's so good. And that's something that I deal with a lot. Well-meaning church people come alongside, they mean so well. They want to comfort. People just a lot of times don't know what to say. And so they feel that something is better than nothing. But realizing that, unless you meet that person where they are, and in a lot of cases, that's hard to define. They don't know where they are. And so if you're not able to discern that, that can do more harm than good. They remember the things that had been said to them.
They do, and internalize that in ways, and then that becomes part of that, ball of string that we're then parsing out. And just to be clear, I have said these things to people when I didn't know better, and it's through years of the work that I've been doing. I'm like, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah, me too.
This can have repercussions beyond what I know.
Yeah.
And I like to quote a professor of mine in seminary that said, when someone's in crisis, the best thing to do is you show up and you shut up. That person doesn't need a sermon, right? It is, like you said before, that ministry of presence that is more effective.
And, there's no shame or judgment when we talk about some of those things because, been there, done that. We're all at different places in our spiritual journey and we're learning constantly, how to better serve others. And so thanks for that clarification point. Yeah, that's not to cast blame, but it's to say, all right, maybe let's pause and think about some things. And I've often heard this illustration. There was a man, he was a pastor, and he visited with a family that was mourning. Okay. And as he visited, he just really felt the Spirit strongly speak to his heart. Just be there. Don't speak. Just be there. And he said, I greeted the family when I came in, and I just sat with them. And I intentionally did not say a word. And I spent hours with them, and then when I felt it was time to leave, I got up and I left. And then he said down the road, one of the family members said, when you were sitting with us, the things you said were so insightful that we'll never forget it. They minister to us so much. And the guy's like, I didn't say a word. But it's that ministry of presence, right?
I love it.
Yeah, so a lot of times when we shut up, it allows the Spirit to kind of minister to these people in a very tangible way.
Yeah, and it's so beautiful. I train in my job. I train interns on how to be chaplain, and a lot of times they may be established clergy who are trying to get credentialed in hospital chaplaincy. And after listening to me and all of my diatribes, and they're with patients and families who are essentially saying goodbye to their loved ones, and they're not saying anything. They are shocked when at the end, as they're walking the family out of the hospital, the family says to them, "Thank you for everything." And the interns come back to my office and say to me, "I didn't do anything."
Right.
And so I like to stress that there's a difference between the doing and the being. And, what we're doing in that moment is we are being with people and bearing witness to what they're going through. And there's so much power in that.
Yeah. And just, validating what they're going through, validating their feelings, and, not trying to make sense of it in the moment. I think that there's that temptation, particularly on us ministers, because people look to us and say,
you're supposed to be able to preach a word.
Yeah, why is this happening? And sometimes the answer is, I don't know. I mean, yes, in a way, I am a representative of the Lord, but I don't, I can't explain the Lord.
And
we
that's where
don't
we
have
can do more
adequate words.
damage, right?
Yeah.
If we're seen as God's mouthpiece. And there's been new research that comes out too, in terms of the why is this happening? That question. When people are asking that, especially in those crisis moments, it's not that they're looking for an answer, but it is an expression of pain. It's a lament.
It's a heart
almost.
Cry. Yeah.
A heart cry. I love that phrase.
That's beautiful, and not feeling the pressure to answer.
Correct.
But just be there.
Which is hard. It is tempting to answer, especially if you have a beautiful message of the Odyssey that you can share right then and there. And I see my interns do it, and I'm like, that's great. Write that down somewhere else.
Yeah.
But that's not what that person needs in that moment. They need the space to be able to give voice to their heart cry.
Love it. That's so helpful. And I'm glad we went there with some of this. And so, kind of branching out from there, where does self-care come in when it comes to the life of one who is following the Lord? What role have you found that plays in the spiritual life of a believer?
Yeah, I think many of us, and again, I'm guilty as charged, this is why I can see it now, have the mentality that God is wanting us to do this, right? And so, and sometimes that leads us into this Superman or Superwoman tendency of the wanting to fix, feeling like we can't possibly take rest because the church needs us to function, right? And if how can we take rest from, what we are called by God to do? And so that, combined with, the Protestant work ethic in our society, it kind of can be a recipe for disaster. And the other piece that I see, and this isn't just clergy, I see this a lot in healthcare too, is people who are in denial about actually needing self-care and saying, no, I'm fine. Like, this isn't impacting me. Like, I will go up to staff after there's been, a significant death of a patient and say, what are you going to do to care for yourself tonight? And the nurse will be like, oh no, I'm just going to keep going and chart. Right. And so it's really, I think, first and foremost, acknowledging, this is not like a luxury.
Right.
Self-care is a necessity, and we're almost denying our own needs if we say that we're not impacted by something. But people want to come across as strong. And it takes some vulnerability sometimes to say, no, I do need to care for myself and I do need time away.
Especially those in the helping professions. We're pouring out and we see the needs and we want to meet the needs. And then we almost feel guilty. There's this guilt aspect of, if I take time for me, then that's less time I have to fulfill my calling, to fulfill my purpose. But then there's also this realization, this deep realization that I think comes with time and experience. And, you can't pour from an empty cup. And that's something I really learned the hard way. When I was in my early days of ministry, I didn't know the word no. So when I was asked to do anything in the church, it was yes, absolutely. I'm willing to do anything. I will do whatever I need to do. That got me to a point of overextension. And just there were no breaks in my life. I would work my day job all day. As a pharmacist, I would come home and I'd be prepping for the next thing for church, and I'd be delivering that. And I'm an introvert by nature, and so that's particularly hard on us because we need time away from those things. We need me time. And long story short, I ended up having some physical signs of stress to the point where I had shortness of breath, chest pain, like thought I was having a heart attack. Went to my physician. He's a Christian guy. He did all the tests that he needed to do, everything on the heart, EKG, all these things. And he came back, he said, everything checks out okay. The good news is you're okay. The bad news is you're not okay. I said, well, what do you mean by that?
Oh my goodness, what a word.
Yeah. And he said, well, would you say you're stressed? And I'll tell you this, my instinct and what I blurted out was no. I didn't even think about it. It was just, it was defensive. No. And then I paused and said, maybe. And I think he could see that in me. So we talked about, okay, what's your life look like? He was able to coach me through some ways of caring for myself. And so I had to learn that the hard way. You have to take care of you in order to take care of other people. And so, speaking to that, what are some ways that we can implement self-care into our lives that don't detract from our purpose, that don't detract from our calling? What are some ways that you recommend as a spiritual director, as a chaplain, as a minister, that we can spend time taking care of us so that we can take care of others?
Yeah. And what a powerful story. And I think by your sharing it, hopefully helping other people to know that this happens to all of us.
Yeah, you're not alone.
And so I think, based on what you're talking about, one of the things that I like to preach at people around self-care is that setting of boundaries, of saying no, right? Like you kept saying yes for all these beautiful opportunities to serve. Yeah. But sometimes it is about saying no. And my trick that I'll tell you, if you're talking with Christians, that I'll sometimes say is, let me pray about that first. And then I'm going to get back to you. If you're not good at saying no and you need to buy yourself some time, that's one way to do it.
That's
but
perfect.
Really recognizing what is going to be life-giving for you and what might be draining, and what is the balance that you need.
Yeah.
And so the boundary piece is important. Something else that I think comes up when we're talking about self-care that makes it difficult is it's not just, a list of things to do, right? People don't need more items on their to-do list. It's, which I could give you items, but that it's going to vary so much for everyone. But it's this mentality of caring for yourself throughout your day. It's not just saving enough to go on a vacation. It is really living that framework. And, one of the things that I suggest for a lot of people that is very meaningful and sometimes they're surprised by is that self-care can be as simple as how are we talking to ourselves?
Yeah, those thoughts.
And I don't know about you, but I talk to myself much worse than I would ever dream of talking to someone else.
100%.
Like the negative. Like we beat ourselves up, we judge ourselves, and all in the way of trying to motivate ourselves. But what we really could use is some self-compassion. How are we being gracious to ourselves.
Yeah. Give
And
yourself
with my
grace.
spiritual directees, I sometimes say, like, how would God talk to you? And that is very different than
Yes.
how we sometimes talk to ourselves.
Well, I love the concept. It's not a list of things to do, because we don't need more lists. We have enough lists. We're not meeting the list we currently have. Let's not add to that.
Yep.
Let's change the way we think about it, because then it becomes less of a list and it becomes more of a habit, more of automatic.
Yeah, that mindset.
And self-care can be a beautiful thing. And one of the aspects of self-care that perhaps we can get into for just a second is this concept of Sabbath rest. And you'd mentioned something just a second ago that kind of made me think about this. And really, in a way, it kind of comes down to a trust issue, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do I trust that God, and this plays out in so many different areas of our life and in our Christian journey and our Christian walk, but do I trust God that He can do more in 6 days than I can in 7? Do I trust God that He, even with our tithe, do I trust God that He can do more with that 10% than I can do with the full 100%?
Yes.
I am I'm a tool in the Father's hand, but He's the power behind it. So, is that similar to kind of how you would see that as well, as far as this idea of rest? Because it's hard for us, particularly in this day and age, because we're more productive than ever.
And more connected than ever in some ways.
But in a lot of ways, studies show us that we're also lonelier than ever. We're more detached than ever, despite the connection, and even more burned out than we've ever been. And so, just interested your thoughts on that issue of rest.
Yeah, I think there's something to that, and like you said, the trust, the control. It's also, the ego of it, right? Yeah. That, if I go away, the church isn't going to be able to function.
Yeah.
Well, how do you know that if you don't go away, right? And how can you view it as this is an opportunity to empower other ministry leaders, other members of the congregation, to let them be able to take up those reins in a way that is going to be, meaningful for them, and that it's not all about me. And I will say this as well, because I do think this comes up for a lot of the people I work with, that ministry professionals are in awkward positions because a lot of them, their full-time work, they are reliant on the church to pay their salary. And so I do want to highlight that, because I do think that there's our own individual guilt and shame, but then there are sometimes the expectations of other people. Absolutely. And so the fear can be very real. So I don't want to minimize that. And so pointing that out, especially for your listeners who are making up, the congregations, for them to know, help your leaders to rest.
Yeah, that's right. Help your pastor. There is that pressure that's there for a lot of people. And just acknowledging that and validating that, I think, is awfully important. So shifting gears before we close, I would like to talk a little bit about the spiritual disciplines. If someone's wanting to go deeper with God, I once heard an evangelist say, you can go as deep as you want to with God. And I love that. The question is, how deep do you want to go? But if someone's wanting to deepen their journey, their relationship with the Lord, what are some spiritual practices that you recommend they put into place that will really help them get off the ground with some of that?
Yeah. So again, much like self-care, much like, what I do for self-care might not be the same as what you do for self-care. Right. It's going to vary, right? But some practices that I've introduced to people that they might not have heard of before, and I always say, try them on. It may not be your thing. That may not be what leads to the deepening that you're looking for, but it might. You never know.
Sure.
Something I love that, again, I think is a best kept secret of the church is called centering prayer. And it is it's a simple practice, and you can Google it and learn how to do it online. But it involves, saying a word for God and returning to that word over and over. So that would be one that I would recommend. For some people, they really enjoy journaling. So writing whatever comes to their mind, and sometimes it's writing letters to God, or writing letters to Jesus, or just journaling around a particular scripture is sometimes helpful because it helps them to connect more deeply, which another practice that's similar to that. his Lectio Divina. It's a reading of a short passage of scripture, not looking for all the exegetical information that could be, withheld there, but really like, how is this speaking to my life today?
Right.
And searching for an invitation. And another practice that I love, but is not for everyone, is silence. Because sometimes it is hard to listen to God when there is so much noise and so much chatter. And I'm also a mom of 2 young boys. So this is why in this season of my life, I'm especially interested in silence. Like I said, not for everyone.
Yes, and amen. I have three under 8, so I get that.
Oh, there you go. So and so really trying to make space for that and be intentional about that, which is countercultural, right? Like, because we can fill up that silence all the time, which is the same thing that we're talking about at the bedside, right? Or when you're with people in pain, giving space for the silence and being okay and comfortable and sitting in it.
And those are so powerful, particularly the silence, because you mentioned it as countercultural. In our world, there's so much noise. And we become, I don't want to use this word lightly, but we become almost addicted to the noise, to where when we separate ourselves from it, we almost have withdrawals because we're like, oh, I've got it. What am I doing? It's too quiet.
You were just sitting with our own thoughts, and we're not talking very nicely to ourselves.
Right.
So we want to distract ourselves.
Absolutely. And so, even to the point where, like we're walking around our house, but then we've also got our phone out and we're checking our emails because we can't help but just, even in those small moments of quiet, we can't help but fill our minds and feel, there's noise from everywhere. And so finding a time to be alone and quiet with the Lord, with your thoughts, with the Spirit, is a beautiful thing. Well, thank you so much, Christine. If I have some listeners who want to get in touch with you, and I have a feeling I will because this has been fantastic, how do they enter into your world? How can they find you, and how can they kind of go deeper with you with some of these things that you're able to help people with?
Sure. Thanks for asking. So I have a website. It's Christine, V as in Victor, and then my last name, Davies, Davies .com. And you can send me an email there. You can inquire about doing individual spiritual direction. All of my social media links are on there. And the other thing that I do that people may be interested in is I try to write a weekly article that's on my Substack, it's on my website, but it's journeying alongside that Substack, which is about different stories from the hospital, different practices that you may want to try, and things that come up. And I always take requests. So if there's something that you want to hear about or want to read about, open to
really
writing
cool
about those as well.
Yeah, I signed up for the newsletter today, so I'm excited to get my first one. But yeah, you guys go check her out. She's doing fantastic work. This has been a treasure. I've enjoyed every minute of this conversation. Maybe we can jump on another one and hash out some other things. This has been really neat. So
I've loved being with you.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. Have a blessed day, and appreciate you joining us here. Thank you for listening to the RevRx podcast. We hope you enjoyed what you heard today, and if so, we'd love it if you would hit that subscribe button so that you'll never miss a new episode from us. Also, feel free to leave us reviews and comments, as we'd love to hear from you. Be blessed and be the very best you.